Dubai, a city where glass towers pierce the clouds like crystal daggers, where every street gleams under artificial perfection, and where weddings don't just celebrate love, they announce power, status, and legacy to the world. In this city of superlatives, where nothing is too extravagant and everything must be flawless, one wedding in 2024 promised to be the event of the season. Gold-trimmed invitations.
A venue that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Guest lists that read like a who's who of regional elite. But this wedding wouldn't make headlines for its beauty. It would become infamous for lasting just a few hours before everything collapsed into darkness and horror. By the time the sun rose over the Persian Gulf the next morning, the bride was dead. The groom had vanished into the desert like a ghost fleeing his own crime. And investigators would soon discover that this tragedy wasn't a sudden explosion of passion or a moment of uncontrolled rage. No, this was a plan. A calculated scheme that had been set in motion years before that fatal night, piece by methodical piece. Before we go any further into this story, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now telling me which country you're watching from. Seriously, I love seeing where this community is tuning in from, whether you're in Lagos, London, New York, Mumbai, or anywhere else on this planet. Let me know you're here. This case affected people globally, and I want to see how far this message reaches. This isn't just a true crime story. It's a warning about what happens when we allow toxic mindsets to fester in silence, when we prioritize appearances over truth, and when we give dangerous people the benefit of the doubt simply because they wear expensive suits and smile for the camera. Let me introduce you to the groom. Rashid, one that carries the weight of tradition and old money prestige that his real name commanded. Rashid was born into the kind of wealth most people only see in movies. His family's fortune stretched back generations, built on real estate empires, international business dealings, and connections that reached into the highest levels of government and commerce. When Rashid walked into a room, people noticed, not because he demanded attention through loudness or arrogance, but because he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once questioned his place at the top of society's hierarchy. To everyone who knew him, friends, business associates, distant relatives, Rashid appeared to be the perfect gentleman, calm in his demeanor, traditional in his values, generous with his wealth when it came to charity events and community causes. He dressed impeccably, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had the kind of educational pedigree that opened every door before he even had to knock. His family was respected, his business acumen was praised, his future seemed not just bright but absolutely guaranteed. But here's what nobody knew. Here's what makes this case so chilling and so infuriating at the same time. Behind that polished exterior, behind those calm eyes and that gentle smile, Rashid harbored a secret compulsion that had been growing for years. He didn't just date women, he investigated them. He stalked them. He spent countless hours creating fake social media accounts, tracking their movements, accessing their private messages, and building detailed files on their personal histories. He was obsessed with one thing: finding evidence of their past relationships, their previous romantic connections, anything he could twist into ammunition. And when he found what he was looking for, or sometimes even when he didn't, when he simply invented scenarios and manipulated digital evidence, he would systematically work to humiliate these women. He would leak their information to their families. He would send anonymous messages to their workplaces. He would craft elaborate schemes to expose what he perceived as moral failings, all while presenting himself as the wronged party, the man who had been deceived and deserved sympathy. This wasn't something he did once or twice. This was a pattern. Multiple women over the course of years found themselves suddenly drowning in shame and social destruction, never quite understanding how their private lives had become public spectacles. Some lost their jobs, some were disowned by their families, some fell into depression so severe they required hospitalization. And through it all, Rashid maintained his spotless reputation, playing the role of the victim with such skill that people actually felt sorry for him. He believed genuinely, deeply believed that he had the right to do this. That as a man from his background, with his status and his values, he was entitled to judge women and punish them for not meeting his impossible standards. This wasn't love. This wasn't even traditional courtship. This was predation dressed up in the language of honor and respectability. Now let me tell you about the bride. Amira. She was everything her society told women they should be. Academically accomplished with degrees from prestigious universities, fluent in 4 languages, professionally successful in a field that required both intelligence and grace. She carried herself with poise and dignity, the kind of woman who could navigate a formal dinner with diplomats as easily as she could discuss literature or current events. Her family was proud of her achievements, and she had worked tirelessly to build a life that balanced modern ambition with cultural expectations. But Amira had a past. Not a scandalous one, not by any reasonable measure, but one that would be judged harshly in certain circles. Years before, she had been in a relationship, a serious one. She had loved someone, and that relationship had eventually ended like many relationships do, not in disaster or betrayal, but simply because two people realized they weren't right for each other. She had kept this relationship relatively private, not out of shame, but out of an understanding of the cultural pressures that surrounded her. She knew that, in her community, a woman's romantic history could be weaponized against her, used to diminish her worth or question her character. So she had moved on, built her career, focused on her future, and tried not to think too much about how unfair it was that her past could be held against her while men were given infinite grace for their romantic histories. Then, the messages started arriving, strange, unsettling messages that made her blood run cold, screenshots of old conversations she thought had been deleted years ago, photos from her previous relationship that should have been impossible for anyone to access, threatening text messages from unknown numbers warning her that her secrets would be revealed, cryptic emails that seemed to know details about her life that only someone conducting serious surveillance could possibly know. At first, she thought it might be her ex-boyfriend, perhaps bitter about their breakup despite the fact that it had been years and both had moved on. But the more she investigated, the more she realized this wasn't the pattern of someone from her past. This was something more calculated, more systematic. Someone was watching her. Someone was building a file on her. Someone was preparing to destroy her reputation, and she had no idea who or why. The fear was overwhelming. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, checking her devices for spyware, changing her passwords, limiting her social media presence. She confided in a few close friends who encouraged her to go to the police, but she hesitated. What would she report? Creepy messages? Leaked photos that weren't even explicit? In a society where women were often blamed for the harassment they received, would authorities even take her seriously? And then came the major twist that transformed this entire story from simple harassment into something far more sinister. Amira was careful, she was intelligent, and she refused to be a passive victim. She started her own investigation. She began tracking the IP addresses of the fake accounts messaging her. She used forensic tools to analyze the metadata of the leaked photos. She cross-referenced the timing of certain messages with events in her life, and slowly, piece by digital piece, she uncovered the truth. It wasn't a stranger stalking her. It wasn't her ex-boyfriend seeking revenge. It was Rashid, the man who had been courting her family, the man who had been presenting himself as a potential husband, the wealthy, respected gentleman who had seemed almost too perfect to be true. Can you imagine that moment of realization? Can you feel the ice-cold horror of discovering that the person offering you marriage, the person your family was encouraging you to accept, was the same person who had been terrorizing you for months? That his romantic interest wasn't based on love or even genuine attraction, but was instead part of a calculated strategy to get close to you, to control you, to possess evidence he could use against you? The proposal wasn't romance, it was a trap, a carefully constructed cage disguised as a gift. And here's where this case becomes even more complex and more tragic, because Amira made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. Instead of exposing Rashid immediately, instead of going to the authorities or her family with the truth, she decided to play along. She accepted his proposal. She smiled and thanked him, and wore the engagement ring, and began planning the wedding. Why? Because she had discovered something else during her investigation, something that made her realize this wasn't just about her anymore. Both families, hers and his, were hiding massive secrets that made this marriage essential for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Amira's family, despite their public image of stability and success, was drowning in crisis. There were debts, serious debts to dangerous people who didn't negotiate or offer extensions. There was political pressure stemming from her father's business dealings, investigations that threatened to expose corruption and send him to prison. There were scandals being suppressed through expensive lawyers and carefully placed bribes. Her family needed this marriage not just for social status, but for survival. Rashid's family's wealth and connections could make their problems disappear, could buy them protection, could save them from complete ruin. And Rashid's family had their own secrets rotting beneath the surface of their perfect reputation, business troubles that went far beyond normal market fluctuations, legal risks involving offshore accounts and tax evasion, internal conflicts between siblings that threatened to tear their empire apart. They needed this marriage too. They needed the connection to Amira's family's political network. They needed the appearance of stability and tradition to reassure their business partners and investors. Both families saw this wedding as a solution to problems they couldn't solve any other way. Neither side cared about whether Amira and Rashid actually loved each other. Neither side wanted to acknowledge the warning signs that something was deeply, dangerously wrong. They were too invested in the illusion, too desperate for the benefits this union would provide. So the wedding planning began, and from the outside, it looked absolutely perfect. Dubai doesn't do anything halfway, and this wedding was being designed to cement both families' status as untouchable elite. The venue was one of those impossible luxury hotels where the chandeliers cost more than houses and every surface gleams with imported marble and gold. The decor included thousands of roses flown in from Ecuador. The guest list included ambassadors, celebrities, business moguls, and social media influencers whose mere presence would generate millions of impressions. But inside the planning meetings, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Amira played her role flawlessly, smiling and nodding as her future mother-in-law discussed seating arrangements and menu selections. But in private, she was gathering evidence. She was documenting Rashid's harassment campaigns against other women. She was building a file that would expose not just him, but the entire system that had protected him and enabled his predatory behavior. And Rashid? He was preparing too. He had spent months collecting what he believed was damning evidence of Amira's past. He had screenshots, doctored messages, manipulated photos designed to make her look far worse than reality. He had carefully planned how he would reveal this evidence not before the wedding, because he needed the marriage to be official, to be legally binding, so that his family's connection to hers would be secured. But after, in the privacy of their wedding night, he would confront her, would break her down, would establish his dominance and control from the very first moment of their marriage. Both families continued to push the wedding forward despite the signs that something was catastrophically wrong. There were arguments that got heated enough for neighbors to overhear. There were moments when Amira looked absolutely terrified during what should have been joyful planning sessions. There were times when Rashid's mask slipped and people saw flashes of anger that didn't match his gentleman persona. But nobody stopped it. Nobody asked the questions that needed to be asked. Because at this level of society, appearances matter more than truth. Image matters more than safety, and maintaining the fiction of perfection matters more than protecting someone's life. Tell me in the comments right now, have you ever witnessed this? Have you ever seen two families acting completely friendly in public while you knew they were hiding something massive behind the scenes? Have you ever watched people go through with major life decisions when everyone around them could sense the disaster coming but nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud? I want to hear your stories because this dynamic isn't unique to this case. It happens everywhere, in every culture, whenever we value reputation over reality. The wedding day arrived like a golden sunrise over the Persian Gulf, and to everyone watching, it was perfection incarnated. The photos that flooded social media that day looked like something from a fairy tale. Amira, in a custom gown that reportedly cost over $200,000, covered in crystals that caught the light like 1,000 stars. Rashid in a suit tailored so precisely, it looked like it had been painted onto his body. The venue transformed into something that didn't look real, like a palace built entirely of flowers and gold and light. Guests posed for photos against backdrops of roses and orchids. Influencers went live to their millions of followers, gushing about the beauty and elegance of the event. News outlets covered it as a celebration of tradition and luxury. Everyone who was anyone wanted to be seen there, wanted to be part of this moment, wanted to attach themselves to this display of wealth and status. And Amira and Rashid played their roles without a single mistake. They smiled at exactly the right moments. They held hands during the ceremony with what looked like genuine affection. They danced their first dance while hundreds of guests applauded, and cameras captured every angle. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple, the ideal marriage of tradition and modernity, of family legacy and personal achievement. But hidden within the folds of Amira's elaborate dress was a small recording device, a piece of technology no bigger than a lipstick, positioned where it couldn't be seen but could capture everything that would be said in the hours to come. She had decided that if this night went the way she feared it would, there would be evidence, there would be proof. There would be no way for Rashid to claim innocence or play the victim like he had done with so many women before her. And hidden in Rashid's belongings, carefully packed in his overnight bag and waiting in their honeymoon suite, were files, printed documents, USB drives, screenshots organized into folders, surveillance notes detailing Amira's movements over the past year. He had prepared his revelation like a prosecutor preparing for trial, ready to systematically destroy her sense of self and establish his absolute authority over her life going forward. Two people, both armed with evidence against the other, both prepared for confrontation, dancing together while hundreds of guests smiled and celebrated around them. The slow burn of tension rising toward an inevitable explosion. The reception lasted for hours. Course after course of food that most guests barely touched because they were too busy networking and posing for photos. Toast after toast, celebrating the happy couple and the joining of two prestigious families, music and dancing and champagne flowing like water. And through it all, both Amira and Rashid counting down the minutes until they could escape to the privacy of their suite, where the real wedding night would begin. Finally, after midnight, after the last guest had been thanked and the last photo had been taken, they left the reception. They walked through the hotel's marble corridors toward the honeymoon suite that had been prepared for them, a space of luxury that would soon become a battleground. The doors closed behind them, and the illusion of the perfect wedding day evaporated like morning mist. What happened in that room over the next few hours would shock investigators and horrify everyone who heard the full story. But I want to be very clear about something before I continue. I will not give you graphic details. I will not sensationalize violence. I will not turn someone's death into entertainment. What I will do is tell you the truth about how two people's toxic game of exposure and control spiraled into tragedy. Inside that private suite, with the sounds of the city muted by thick walls and bulletproof glass, Rashid made his move. He didn't wait for romance or intimacy. He didn't pretend this was going to be a normal wedding night. Instead, he pulled out his files, his printed evidence, his screenshots and his notes and his carefully prepared presentation of everything he believed proved that Amira was unworthy of him, that she had deceived him, that she deserved to be punished for her past. He spoke to her not as a husband, but as a prosecutor, his voice cold and controlled. He detailed her previous relationship as if it were a crime. He presented photos as if they were evidence of moral failure. He explained how he had tracked her, stalked her, built this case against her over months of surveillance. And he made it clear that this wasn't about ending their marriage. This was about establishing the terms of it. This was about making sure she understood that he held all the power, that he knew everything about her, and that if she ever disobeyed him, or embarrassed him, or failed to meet his expectations, he would destroy her reputation completely. But Amira didn't collapse. She didn't cry or beg or play the role of the terrified victim that Rashid had expected. Instead, she calmly reached into her belongings and pulled out her own files. She had documented everything. Every fake social media account he had created, every woman he had harassed before her, every manipulation tactic he had used. She had screenshots of his messages to previous victims. She had testimonies from women he had driven to the edge of suicide. She had evidence of the surveillance equipment he had purchased. She had traced his digital footprints across years of predatory behavior, and she told him that she had already sent copies of everything to journalists, to women's rights organizations, to authorities, that if anything happened to her, if she disappeared or was hurt or suddenly changed her story, the truth about him would explode across every news outlet in the region. Can you imagine the shift in that room? The moment when Rashid realized he wasn't the hunter anymore? That his victim had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time? That his carefully constructed plan had been anticipated and countered? The room became a battleground of truth and ego. Two people who had both been playing chess, both believing they held the winning strategy, suddenly facing each other across a divide that couldn't be bridged. Rashid's mask of gentlemanly calm shattered completely. All the rage he had kept hidden beneath polite society manners erupted to the surface. And Amira, who had carried the weight of fear and planning for so long, finally allowed her own anger to show. They argued, voices rising from controlled debate to shouting, accusations flying like weapons, each trying to assert dominance, each refusing to back down, each realizing that this marriage couldn't exist, that the alliance between their families was built on foundations too rotten to support the weight of their combined secrets. And then, In a moment that lasted seconds but changed everything forever, the confrontation turned physical, a burst of anger that crossed a line that can never be uncrossed, a moment of violence that would end one life and destroy another. By dawn, when hotel staff knocked on the door of the honeymoon suite to deliver the breakfast that had been pre-ordered as part of the luxury package, there was no answer. They knocked again, called the room phone, finally used their master key to enter, following protocol for wellness checks when guests don't respond. What they found inside that room made them immediately call security, who called the police, who called their superiors, who realized this was going to be a case that would attract international attention. Amira was dead. Her body showed signs of a violent struggle. The room itself told the story of a confrontation that had escalated far beyond argument, and Rashid was gone. He had fled the hotel sometime in the early morning hours, taking his documents, taking his phone, disappearing into Dubai's sprawling landscape of highways and desert. The police manhunt began immediately. But almost as quickly as it started, investigators began uncovering a story far more complex than a simple wedding night tragedy. Because Amira's recording device had captured everything, every word, every threat, every revelation. The full confrontation preserved in digital audio that would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. And when they examined both Amira's and Rashid's electronic devices and cloud storage accounts, they discovered a systematic pattern of behavior that went back years. Rashid wasn't just a man who had killed his wife in a moment of rage. He was a predator who had been operating with impunity, protected by his family's wealth and status, enabled by a culture that gave men like him the benefit of the doubt while blaming his victims. The investigators found files on dozens of women, detailed surveillance notes, screenshots of private conversations obtained through hacking and social engineering, evidence of harassment campaigns that had destroyed careers and reputations. Testimony started flooding in from women who had been too afraid to come forward before, who had thought they were alone in their experiences, who now realized that what had happened to them was part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. And they found evidence of both families' corruption. The debts and the bribes and the offshore accounts and the political pressures that had made this marriage seem essential. The web of secrets that had pushed Amira and Rashid together, despite every warning sign that this union would end in disaster. The case exploded across international media, not just because of the wealth and glamour of the families involved, but because it represented something larger. It exposed how obsession and entitlement and toxic masculinity can flourish when protected by money and social status. It revealed how women are systematically silenced and blamed, even when they're the victims. It showed how family pressure and cultural expectations can trap people in dangerous situations they feel powerless to escape. Rashid was found 3 days later, attempting to cross into a neighboring country using a fake passport his family had helped him obtain. He was arrested, extradited back to Dubai, and charged with murder, along with a long list of other crimes related to his years of stalking and harassment. The trial became a spectacle. Not a circus, but something far more serious and somber. The courtroom filled every day with journalists from around the world, with women's rights activists, with representatives from organizations dedicated to fighting digital harassment and stalking, and, most importantly, with women. Women who had been Rashid's previous victims. Women who had never thought they would have the chance to tell their stories publicly. Women who had been silenced by shame and fear, and the knowledge that society would blame them rather than believe them. One by one, they took the stand and testified. They described how Rashid had tracked them, manipulated them, destroyed their reputations and their mental health. They showed the messages he had sent, the fake accounts he had created, the systematic campaigns of humiliation he had orchestrated, and they explained how they had reported him to authorities before, to social media platforms, to their own families, and had been dismissed, ignored, or blamed for somehow inviting his attention. The evidence against Rashid was overwhelming. The recording from the wedding night alone was enough to convict him. But prosecutors didn't stop there. They presented the full picture of who Rashid was. Not a gentleman who had made one terrible mistake, but a predator who had hidden behind privilege and reputation while systemically abusing women for years. The judge's final statement during sentencing became famous. It was shared across social media, quoted in news articles, turned into posters by advocacy groups. The judge said that this case represented a moment of reckoning for a society that had allowed men like Rashid to operate with impunity for too long. That hiding behind concepts of honor and tradition while destroying women's lives wasn't honorable, it was cowardly and criminal. That using family wealth and connections to escape consequences while victims suffered in silence was a corruption of justice that had to end. Rashid was sentenced to life in prison. His family's reputation was destroyed. Their business empire collapsed as partners, and investors fled from the association. Other investigations were opened into their various corrupt dealings, leading to additional arrests and prosecutions. But more importantly, Amira's case sparked real change. New laws were passed specifically targeting digital stalking and harassment, with serious criminal penalties and mechanisms for protecting victims who came forward. Social media platforms were pressured to improve their reporting systems and response protocols. Universities and workplaces implemented education programs about consent, privacy, and healthy relationships. Support networks were established for women facing harassment, with legal aid and psychological counseling provided free of charge. Amira's name, which her family had initially wanted to keep private to avoid scandal, became a symbol, not of shame or victimhood, but of courage and resistance. She had fought back against her stalker, using intelligence and preparation. She had refused to accept the role of passive victim. And even though she didn't survive to see the impact of her bravery, her legacy lived on in every woman who came forward with their own stories, every predator who was finally held accountable, every law that made it harder for abusers to hide behind wealth and status. Think about the layers of tragedy in this case. A young woman who did everything right. She was educated, accomplished, careful, intelligent, still ended up dead because the society around her valued appearances over safety. Two families so desperate to maintain their power and reputation that they pushed their children into a doomed marriage despite obvious warning signs. A man so convinced of his own righteousness and entitlement that he saw nothing wrong with destroying women's lives to satisfy his need for control. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of temporary insanity or an accident that spiraled out of control. This was the inevitable result of toxic beliefs and dangerous behaviors that were enabled, protected, and allowed to flourish because people in positions of power and privilege decided that maintaining the status quo was more important than protecting vulnerable people. And here's what makes me absolutely furious about this case. It was preventable. Every single step of the way, there were moments when someone could have intervened. When Rashid's previous victims reported him, authorities could have investigated seriously instead of dismissing their complaints. When Amira's friends noticed her fear and stress, her family could have prioritized her safety over their social and financial needs. When wedding planners and hotel staff noticed the tension between the couple, someone could have asked the hard questions instead of assuming everything was fine behind closed doors. But those interventions didn't happen. Because we live in a world where women's fear is treated as paranoia until they're dead, where men's dangerous behavior is excused as passion or protection of honor, where family reputation matters more than individual safety, where wealth can buy silence and connections can erase consequences. Amira knew she was in danger. She prepared for it. She documented everything. She tried to protect herself within a system designed to fail women like her. And she still died, alone in a hotel room that was supposed to be the beginning of her married life, killed by a man who thought he had the right to control and punish her. Cases like this show us something crucial about how dangerous secrets become when power and ego collide with entitlement and obsession. Rashid didn't see himself as a predator. He genuinely believed he was upholding values, protecting standards, exposing deception. He had convinced himself that his actions were justified, even righteous. And that self-deception, combined with the resources to act on his impulses and the privilege that protected him from consequences, created a person capable of destroying multiple lives without ever questioning whether he might be the villain in his own story. And the families? They saw their children as chess pieces in a game of social and financial survival. They were willing to sacrifice Amira's safety and future happiness to solve problems they had created through their own corrupt dealings and poor decisions. They looked at a clearly troubled relationship and decided their needs were more important than their daughter's fears. This is what happens when we build societies where image matters more than substance, where we judge women for having past relationships but give men infinite grace for predatory behavior, where we allow wealth and status to create separate systems of justice, where we teach young men that they have the right to control and judge women, and teach young women that their worth is determined by their compliance with impossible standards of purity and perfection. So what do you think triggered this specific tragedy? Was it the family pressure that pushed two incompatible and dangerous people together? Was it Rashid's obsession and sense of entitlement that had been building for years? Was it the cultural context that enabled his predatory behavior while silencing his victims? Or was it something deeper, a fundamental corruption in how we understand power, gender, honor, and justice? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you've watched this whole video until the very end, if you've stayed with me through this painful and infuriating story, drop your country in the comments right now. I love seeing our global community connected here on one screen, united in the belief that stories like Amira's deserve to be told, that predators like Rashid deserve to be exposed, and that real change only happens when we refuse to stay silent about injustice. This case affected people around the world. It sparked conversations in living rooms and coffee shops and university classrooms. It made people examine their own beliefs about relationships, honor, privacy, and justice. It forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths about how they treat women and how they enable dangerous men. And that's why we tell these stories here on Shadowed Truths. Not to entertain ourselves with other people's tragedies, not to judge or gawk or feel superior, but to learn, to recognize patterns of abuse and manipulation, to understand how systems of power protect perpetrators while failing victims, to find the courage to intervene when we see warning signs instead of looking away because it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Amira fought back. She refused to be a silent victim. She gathered evidence and prepared for the confrontation she knew was coming. She was brave and intelligent and resourceful, and she still died because one person's toxic entitlement and rage overpowered all her preparation and courage. That's not her failure. That's our collective failure as societies that create and tolerate the conditions where tragedies like this can happen. So let her legacy be this. Every time we see warning signs of abusive behavior, we speak up. Every time we hear someone making excuses for stalking or harassment or controlling behavior, we challenge those excuses. Every time we're tempted to prioritize reputation over safety, we choose differently. Every time we witness someone being silenced or blamed for the abuse they've experienced, we stand with them instead. Amira's wedding lasted just a few hours before disaster shattered the illusion of perfection, but the conversation her case started, the laws that were changed, the women who found courage to come forward because of her story, those things will last forever. That's how we honor her memory. Not with flowers or candlelight vigils, but with action and change, and the absolute refusal to let another woman die because society failed to protect her from someone who felt entitled to destroy her. If this video made you think, made you angry, made you determined to recognize and challenge these patterns in your own life and community, then share it. Let's make sure Amira's story reaches as far as possible. Let's make sure her death meant something. Let's build a world where the next young woman facing a predator like Rashid finds a society ready to believe her, protect her, and hold her abuser accountable before tragedy strikes. Thank you for watching Shadowed Truths. Thank you for engaging with difficult stories. Thank you for being part of a community that refuses to look away from uncomfortable truths. And thank you for remembering that behind every case we cover is a real person whose life mattered, whose story deserves to be told with respect and honesty, and whose legacy can help create the change we desperately need. Drop those comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you think triggered this tragedy. Tell me about times you've seen family pressure override individual safety. And most importantly, tell me what we can do differently to prevent the next Amira from becoming another statistic in the long, painful history of women destroyed by men who thought they had the right to control and judge them. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and never stop questioning the narratives that powerful people want us to accept without examination. This is Real Crime Stories Hub, where we illuminate the darkness that privilege and power try to hide. I'll see you in the next case.